Well, welcome to the Media Roundtable, where we dive deep into the forces that are shaping and reshaping the world of audio, of podcasting, of creator media. And we do this in the service of the brands who support it. I'm your host, Dan Granger. I am the CEO of Oxford Road. And I am joined by a couple very special people today. And honestly, Giles, I've dragged Giles Martin, EVP of Strategy at Oxford Road, into the conversation. And he is just starstruck by the guests that we have with us today. When we go into deep terrain, the deeper the waters, the more likely I am to grab Giles, being really the only legitimate part of the Oxford name, having gone to Oxford and majored in philosophy. He just doesn't know what to do with himself today, because we have a guest who is really a steward of generations of knowledge and ideas that have really helped shape the media ecosystem, fundamentally, philosophically, both in the abstract and the practical. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We have today with us Andrew McLuhan of the McLuhan Institute, which he founded. He is the director and founder. He is the grandson of Marshall McLuhan. He is the son of Eric McLuhan, and teaches media courses globally, and has actually cataloged Marshall McLuhan's annotated library, and worked deeply as a kind of steward, caretaker, and somebody who has carried the torch for the family of some of this kind of groundbreaking thinking that has had such a big impact. If you've heard the term "the medium is the message," this is the group that brought that to the world, and just a lot of ideas that have shaped those that really think about media. And is all of its implications. And we're going to try to unpack all that today. Not all of that, but some of that. And we're going to really try to get to some practical ideas about how does it apply to the world we're in today, because I really think it's a rich and timely topic. And so, Andrew, welcome. We're grateful to have you with us to explore some of these ideas.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you and Giles. Now, if I'd known you were coming from Oxford in philosophy, I would have known to treat this as a hostile conversation, given that my family's background is Cambridge in literature. But
yeah, that's right.
There you
but you're
go.
right. We have a wide range of territory, but my family's concern has long been less in the philosophical or theoretical and more in the practical realm. And that's, as an outsider, somebody who didn't go to university for philosophy or literature or anything, my interest has always been, just because this work is so large, you have to focus on something. And my focus, I decided that what's the point of any of it if we can't use it for something? So in my studies and my readings, I've tended to focus on what can be used from the past against today to help us.
And just to frame it a little bit for those that are coming in cold on this and may not be as familiar with the work, can you just give us a little bit of a backstory on, if you'll allow me to call it, the family business?
Yeah.
And what you steward, because I think it's interesting from so many angles. One is just like, what was the principal set of kind of assets that were created, and then, but also really how you've taken on the mantle of preserving it and sharing it with the world. So if you could at least give us a little bit of a background and baseline, and then we can maybe start to go into some of these ideas and their practical uses.
Sure. I'm fine with calling it a family business. It's a bit of an odd thing to be a family business. McLuhan and Sons media theorists is a strange kind of thing.
I like it.
I like it too, actually. I've thought of painting that on my barn, but It really, that thinking does inform the way that I approach it. For one, it's a generational thing, and it's not that unusual to have a second generation in this kind of discipline. It's a lot more unusual to have a third generation, and it only happened because I got interested in it. And I only got interested in it because it made sense to me later in my life. And I
Mm,
started to understand a few things. And once you start to, it's rabbit holes. Once you start to look
right.
into it, it's like, oh my gosh, that's interesting. And that leads to this, which leads to that. And I've yet to find the bottom of any of these rabbit
Yeah.
holes, really. But, my grandfather, the very quick version, my grandfather studied English literature. In that sense, he was a content guy. He loved poetry and literature. And he studied at Cambridge University in the early 30s at a time when there was a new school of English literary criticism, which wanted to focus on what made good literature good. You know, what does literature do? And long story short, essentially, Marshall took the techniques that he learned for studying literature, poetry, and he started applying them outside of that field. Famously, his first book was called The Mechanical Bride: Folklore of Industrial Man. And it was a study of advertising on, kind of what we would call media literacy today. The idea that people behind advertising have goals and aims, and they're not necessarily for your benefit, but for theirs, right?
Hmm.
This did not endear him to advertisers at the time, but because it wasn't something you did. You didn't treat advertising like you would treat literature. It's kind of a
Mm,
weird thing to do.
yeah.
But Marshall discovered that these same techniques can be used to look at not just poetry and literature and advertising and what was thought of as communication, but technology and culture more broadly. And I think to his as well as everybody else's surprise, they had a lot to say. So that's kind of how he got his start. In the early 20th century, people started getting really interested in communication and what it was all about. And that field of communication studies grew into media studies. And I think one of Marshall McLuhan's major contributions was just broadening this idea of what a medium is. For him, it's not just something that we use to communicate, but everything that we do in order to exceed like our basic bodily equipment is technology, is media, and they all have things in common. And that was a bit of a revelation. He also caught the imagination of advertising people in the 60s and 70s. His book, Understanding Media, followed by The Medium is the Massage, really caught the public imagination, even with just the premise that media could be understood. It was a compelling kind of thing. But I think advertisers then, marketing and advertising people now, can find a lot of value in it because Marshall was interested in effect. What effect do these forms have on us individually and socially? And of course, advertising and marketing people are primarily concerned with effect, you know,
Hmm.
and effectiveness, those two things. The principle being that if you can understand the effect and the principles, the mechanisms behind what makes something attractive, appealing, persuasive, then you can potentially increase the effectiveness, which, of course, is the bottom line. So, McLuhan work can be very challenging for a lot of people, but many who have taken the trouble to look into it have found that it's worth the trouble, just because it helps us understand the relationship between technology and culture. And, more understanding is always a good thing when have an object when you're trying to do something.
So, just thinking about the impact that his work had. I mean, it seems like just kind of benchmarking a little bit or some bellwethers. So, it sounds like he was well received, maybe by youth and countercultural movements, as I've come to understand it. In my understanding, people like John Lennon sought his feedback. I believe he was part of Annie Hall or referenced in
Yeah.
it to some extent, right? So, like when you think about, because as he pointed out 50 years ago, nobody reads really. And so, imagine that you're hearing about this for the first time. When you think about kind of a media philosopher, so to speak, who comes in, you don't realize the kind of breadth and depth of impact that
Mhm.
happened during that time. Can you just talk a little bit about the influence and impact at the early stage, and what it's like preserving that today?
Well, Marshall McLuhan spoke to a lot of people, especially young people, because he said loudly that our systems, particularly the educational system, but also political systems and everything else. He said the generals are always perfectly prepared to fight the previous war. You know,
Right.
um, the thing about our world today is it moves on so quickly, and our institutions are too slow and clunky to keep pace. So he was calling for education reform back in the 40s and 50s, saying that this is not the world we live in anymore. There's more information available outside the classroom than inside it now, and we're doing more harm than good. We should be approaching this differently. We should be teaching perception and how to gather and judge and evaluate information, not just giving them access to stuff they already have access to and telling them things which have very little relevance to their lives anymore. An interesting thing is that when Marshall McLuhan first said the medium is the message in 1958,
Hmm.
it was at a radio broadcasters conference in Vancouver, British Columbia, here in Canada. And at this time, radio broadcasters were very agitated. They were worried because this thing called television had come along and had been taking up more and more and more of the market share for advertising. And of course, this was how radio made its bread and butter. And as television rose, taking on advertising goes where the audience is, and the audience was turning more and more to television and away from radio. And they brought in McLuhan to talk to them about this, and Marshall told them the medium is the message, in which he was saying that television isn't going to kill radio because that's not how media work. That's not how obsolescence works. And he was right. We still have radio. Radio is alive and well, but it doesn't enjoy the place of prominence that it used to. And this is the same with books and reading. We still have books. In fact, more books are published every year than ever before. But books don't serve the same function that they did. Books don't break news. People don't don't go to books really to learn things. There are lots of other places to do it. I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Tony Schwartz, but if you haven't, then you should. Tony Schwartz was an advertising guy in New York City in the 60s, and he was very well known and sought after because he was a deep nerd for audio.
Hmm.
When he was younger, he carried a cassette player and a microphone around New York City and did soundscapes by postal code of New York City. He was yeah, he was deeply interested in audio, and he did some very famous ads, including one, I think it's called Daisy, um, where he focused on the audio dimension of advertising, which was of television advertising, which was counterintuitive for people who thought that television was primarily a visual medium. The thing is that television is audio and video together. And the thing about audio, which you all know, is that it's a very rich source of data, of information, right? So to focus just on the visual at the expense of the audio is to leave, half of nutrition or however you want to say it on the table, you're doing yourself a disservice. In fact, you can probably get away with much lower video quality and higher audio quality and be more effective.
Can you unpack that? Because you're at the center of a nerve that's very important to us.
Yeah.
So why is it so much richer? What is being conveyed in
Well,
the audio that
well,
doesn't get conveyed?
yeah. The thing about the eye as an organ of perception is that it separates things. You look at one thing at a time, right? And in terms of levels of data of information, our eyes are not that great. In terms of experience and the quality of the experience, the eye is kind of poor compared to the ear. The ear is a very rich input. You've never seen something and gotten goosebumps, right? But you
Mm-hmm,
hear something and can have a very visceral reaction.
mm-hmm,
And that testifies to the richness of the input. It has more of an impact than the visual does, which isn't to say that the visual has no impact or we don't care about visual things. That's obviously not the case, but there's the two experiences don't compare. ASMR is a really interesting phenomenon to think about in these terms. We don't have something like that for the eye, and it's a testament to the experience, the richness of audio input that something like ASMR can catch on and be, uh, you know, captivating, if not obsessive, for people.
Tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies: Shopify, DraftKings, Oracle, Warby Parker, Mint Mobile, Quince. I am proud to say that half of the top 10 advertisers in podcasting choose to work with Oxford Road. We are now the world's largest podcast advertising agency, and we do so much more than that: YouTube, radio, streaming. We are on 6 continents working internationally. Reach out to us. We'll tell you about Woven, which is probably the world's largest database of show information that's relevant for brands. Orbit, which is $1.6 billion of aggregated performance data used to de-risk every single campaign. Audiolytics, where we can actually measure ad copy and optimize it to maximize performance. We got a lot going on over here. That's why you can read about us in the Wall Street Journal or the Hollywood Reporter or USA Today or Business Insider. But whatever you need, we try to bring thought leadership that matters to you. Sign up for our newsletter that is called The Influencer. When you go to oxfordroad.com, you can always learn more at the Media Roundtable podcast. We got a lot of interesting content. If you just want to learn about this business, and if you don't care, but you just need somebody to make sure that you're getting outcomes that only we can deliver, go to oxfordroad.com and learn more. And make sure you mention the Media Roundtable, because attribution. That's oxfordroad.com. So my background is in radio and on the advertising side, and frankly working on direct response campaigns for local radio advertisers on a terrestrial AM signal, which
Uh-huh.
was an interesting way to come up. And did that for 10 years, and then kind of followed where the puck was moving into podcasting, and we ended up starting this agency in 2013. But I have this belief that the canvas of podcasting is the greatest canvas in media for the free and open exchange of ideas.
Hmm.
And look, video has always kind of been there with it. Apple would allow you to distribute a video and an audio version of a show, more than a decade ago. But what's happened very recently is there's a lot of question. Just as soon as everybody seemed to know what a podcast was, now nobody does.
Yeah.
And there's been a convergence with YouTube, which has really become the new version of like all the television networks rolled into one plus, right? It's this phenomenon, and it's starting to kind of blend in with the podcast media as it was generally understood. And there's a lot of debate from the people that have come up sort of in the way. It's very interesting when you think about the timing of radio as a nascent medium and where that was in 1958 and the impact of television. That's exactly what we're seeing with podcasting, and the pressure that creators are now facing is everybody says, well, you must do a video now. Video and podcasting are one, and the spoken word medium is kind of being pushed aside. I don't know how much you've been following all this because you're dealing in so many concepts and different types of media, but I would love any perspective that you have.
Well, friends of mine are constantly pushing me to do
To
more
do a video.
video and get on TikTok and stuff, and
Yeah,
it's
right.
like, really?
Where's your TikTok?
Yeah, no. Funnily enough, I have a show called The Spoken Word on our local FM radio, which is audio only, and it's 8 to 9 p.m. Sunday evenings here in Ontario. You can listen to it online if you want. And all I do is sit there and read for an hour, whatever I feel like. Like last week, I was reading sonnets.
Must be nice.
Yeah. Well, it's a community station, so we have some leeway. But I mean, nothing is more ridiculous than a middle-aged guy trying to go on TikTok and be an
Right.
influencer. Like, come on.
Yeah.
That's pretty corny.
But you're getting the same message that everybody's getting, which is everybody's like, oh, if you want to, you have to be everywhere, right? And you have to play every instrument. And but I think what you're if I'm following some of what you're saying is like these different mediums, they are different instruments and they are to be played differently, and they are not the same. But what's been happening is we're saying, no, actually, the banjo and the electric guitar actually need to be one. But we're doing that now. We're like following that. And in some cases, maybe that's okay. But, what do you think the implications are when we start to smash these things together?
We like to chase the shiny new thing. And
Right.
if you like to chase the shiny new thing, you're in a great time because it's constant and relentless.
Yeah.
But the thing about technology, about media is they're all different. There's this corny, terrible joke, but I like it, and it goes to this, and that's that there's these two goats, and they're out behind a Hollywood studio, feeding on the trash pile, right? And the one goat says to the other, "Oh, what do you got there?" And the goat replies, "It's Gone with the Wind," right? Chewing on a print of Gone with the Wind. And the goat says, "Oh, what do you think of it?" And the goat chews for a second. He says, "I think I preferred the book." And the thing is different platforms excel at different things. Right. In terms of the user experience, right? The user experience of a book of Gone with the Wind versus the user experience of a film of Gone with the Wind are very, very different things. The content is the same, essentially, right? But there are things you can do with the book, things you can do with the film differently. And the nature of the audience's experience is quite different, right? The audience works harder reading a book in filling in everything that the film gives you. And this gives them a stake in it, and it gives them an ownership that the film doesn't, right? The film, however, gives you a rich tapestry and allows you to just sit back and chill and take it all in. And there's a place for that as well. Which medium you use depends on a couple of things. For one, what are you trying to achieve? This should always be your first question. First questions. Who are you trying to reach and what are you trying to achieve? You answer those questions and you'll make better decisions about what you're doing and how you go about it.
Does this lend itself to the notion of hot and cool media?
Exactly.
And is that like getting back to the practical? So like when you think about if you're a creator today, or you're a publisher today, or you're an advertiser today, how do you think about what is hot and what is cool, and how you would use those instruments differently?
Mhm. Well, those are 3 very different people, the
Right.
creator, the publisher, the
Yeah,
advertiser,
indeed. Yeah.
and they're interested in very different things. It's an interesting ecosystem to think about. The hot and cool thing, you mentioned Annie Hall,
Hmm.
and it's in Annie Hall that Woody Allen's in this movie lineup, and the guy in front of him is a Columbia film professor, and he's trying to impress his date by talking about McLuhan and a hot medium and this and that, and Woody Allen gets more and more irritated with his date, and the guy eventually turns around to Woody and says, "You know what? I have a right to my opinion." And Woody says, "What? You're full of crap." Like he's like, "Really? Well, what makes you a better authority?" He's like, "Well, I happen to have Marshall McLuhan right here." And this is the funny bit is that Woody Allen pulls Marshall McLuhan from off screen, and here's Marshall McLuhan who tells the professor, "You know nothing of my work. What do you don't know what you're talking about." And it's a great moment, but the hot and cool thing is actually really really simple, and it gets to the nature of the technology and the nature of the response or the effect by the audience or user. And the principle is simply that the more richness of data, the more data you give, the less is required from a user, right?
Hmm.
So in case of the book, right, it's a very low level of information. Your imagination fills in all kinds of blanks,
Hmm.
right? So it's very demanding from a user's point of view. You give a book to a 2-year-old in a baby carriage and you give them a chew toy, right?
Hmm.
It's a really high amount of work on the part of an audience to do anything with a book versus give the kid a iPhone and it's off to
Yeah.
the races in 30 seconds.
Hmm.
But well, this gets into a whole other discussion, but there's cognitive effects and benefits from the one over the other that make it kind of worth the lift. But so hot and
Well,
cool, the cool part is that when you give a very low amount of information, you require more from the user. So it's like the difference between a cartoon or a simple line drawing and a
Hmm.
photograph, right? With a cartoon, you kind of have to do a lot of work figuring out context and what this thing is versus a high definition photograph, which gives you everything. In terms of audio, um, this is where ASMR can be compelling. Is like if you whisper and lower your voice, then you force people to kind of lean in
yeah.
and pay more attention and be more involved. And these are, if you know these things, and if you want people to pay more attention or be more involved, or if you want people to be more passive and sit back and just occupy their eyeballs, well, you want to take one approach or the other.
These are the types of things we talk about quite a lot with our clients, because often a advertiser wants to show their product. And if we're
Mhm.
in audio environments, we can't show the product very easily, but we often will talk about, sort of the benefits of audio, sometimes along the lines of what you've described. And, I just wanted to pick up again on, I think you said this sort of the idea of in podcasting, people are sort of they're more invested than they might be in, hotter medium like TV, where although I think he says sculpt, but like, like a visual, like where there's a lot of inputs. Whereas in podcasting, you've got to invest some of your time and energy and sort of interpretation in consuming the content. And I just wonder, what we would like to tell our clients is that makes podcasting a very special medium, and it makes the interaction between the user and the content, more powerful or more engaging, and ideally it makes ads resonate more strongly with listeners than they might in other environments. And I just wondered if you had any perspective on that.
Sure. I mean, this format, which is, conversational, and, you sent me a few points you wanted to maybe cover on the way, but it's very much conversational and off the cuff, and we're talking.
Right.
When somebody is listening or watching this, they feel like they're part of that conversation, as opposed to something which is very scripted, like a movie or some other kind of dialogue, where they're observing it, and
Yeah.
those are very different things, and particularly when it comes to advertising. um, you want them to do something, right? You want them to buy something. So the more participation, involvement, action, the better.
Well, so, and Giles, what might be interesting is to talk about the study that you just ran, looking at the response rates for YouTube
Mm.
exposure versus audio exposure. Because Andrew, what I hear you suggesting is that, correct me if I'm screwing this up here, but a cooler medium where the consumer is filling in more blanks. If you're doing the spoken version of a podcast, say, you're using that theater of the mind is having to work a little harder. There's a higher level of engagement, which you could argue suggests there's going to be a better ad response. And Giles, I think, if you don't mind just kind of sharing what you learned, what the data
Yeah.
said when we measured that exact thing.
Yes. I mean, once ads started moving to YouTube, podcasting started moving to YouTube, our traditional ways of measuring their effectiveness were cut off on YouTube because Google obviously owns all that environment and you can't put tracking pixels in that environment. So
Hmm.
it's been a big challenge for the industry, especially as more and more impressions and eyeballs go to YouTube. And we were able to come up with an analytical method to sort of um, infer, what the difference in performance is from a podcast advertising impression that appears in YouTube versus a podcast advertising impression in an audio only environment. And I think we all expected the video environment to perform more strongly, and sort of feels like an intuitive bias towards video, generally, which is such an interesting thing. I would love to perhaps get into that with you. But actually we found in a range of about probably 20 to 25, maybe even 20 to 30% weaker on video than it was in audio. Now, I actually think that a lot of that is because of the nature of the user experience there. And I don't know if this really qualifies as a sort of true media thing, but, so much of YouTube is sort of short content consumption and sort of other hooks, to get you to click onto the next thing if you're not, interested in the first thing in the first 10 seconds.
Uh-huh.
Lots of distractions, more algorithmic discovery. Whereas in an audio podcast, I think it's much more of a purposeful, sought out piece of content, and you're not bailing off after the first 10 seconds. So that was our hypothesis about it. We'll be very interested to hear any thoughts that you have on that.
Yeah, well, I don't envy that job, having to try and track those things. What a nightmare. Uh,
That's a lot of the work.
No
It's
comment.
not, if you're media buying, the attribution piece becomes maybe the biggest part of the work and the conversation.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, but it's also fascinating to me to kind of track those kind of changes to an audio only versus an audio and video input, right? Because the the audio only thing is the thing you have to take into account, and the difference, possibly a major difference between radio back in the early 20th century and radio as we call it now, is that the radio, like the television, used to live in the living room, right?
Right.
They were big, clunky things. You gathered around them. father had his slippers and his pipe going, reading the newspaper, listening to the news, right? That's not the case anymore. I don't think most people sit back in an easy chair and listen to a podcast, right?
That's correct.
They're
Not
on the
as
move.
much. Yeah.
This is a huge difference, actually. And same with, although maybe this is getting less so, this is also, I think, maybe a key difference in audio only input versus audio video is that you can be mobile, you can be on transit, you can be running, you can be shopping, listening to a podcast. Whereas not quite the same if you're watching something on YouTube.
Hmm.
Right. So I think it's a bit of an advertiser's dream to be in the audience's ear while they're actively purchasing, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
If you
yeah.
could line those things up. Well, and I think what's interesting is, advertisers have a preconceived notion that audio plus visual equals greater impact. And there
Hmm.
is something to the CSA effect, right? Being able to reinforce if you're giving a call to action in a vanity URL, if you have it running across the screen. Well, it's easier to follow those instructions if you can see it. But I think what you're both landing on is that there is a greater intimacy. When the audience has to work harder to consume and to give it more of their attention, you get less easy come, easy go. And with YouTube, and kind of the same thing with TikTok, like, yeah, you can promote and reach new people there through sampling and low friction ways of getting in front of people, but they're not as committed and invested. And so at the point of consumption of the advertisement, um, you're going to have less attention, less engagement, and lower response ultimately. So it's a trade.
Yeah, because it's a shallow experience versus a richer experience, and um, the richer an experience, the more meaningful it is for us, the more we carry it with us.
Hmm.
And I think that matters a great deal in terms of an impression that it makes.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about the origins of this, I know we're kind of hyper focused on podcasts right now, but what's so fascinating about it is, I don't know when you started listening to them, but at the beginning it was very hard to consume. You
Mm,
couldn't just look at a list and hit play. You had to download it. You had to
yeah.
wait for it to download. You had to go back, and you were hand picking every single program. It wasn't surfacing, here's the next one, here's the next one. So the advertising in the early days, in its infancy, 10 years ago plus, you'll never see that type of response again,
Uh-huh.
because people aren't working as hard to get to it. There is
Yeah.
not
Mm.
that level of intent and engagement. And in addition to things like ad load, but it's been fascinating to watch this whole medium evolve over the last couple of decades, right?
Yeah, and it's been really interesting to me to see. Um, in the early days, I love, for example, NPR in the States will run these Tune to Yesterday programs where
Mm,
they replay an evening of programming from like the 40s and 50s.
mm,
And it's fascinating to listen to, because just the the way the content was delivered was structured so differently. They would program an evening. So you would start with like kids stuff, comedy, lighter stuff. You move into westerns, you move into dramas, and then into like thriller type things as the evening goes on. And just radio dramas, period, are a masterclass in user engagement and
mm.
in
Yeah.
depth and richness of audio. Like, you can learn a lot to go back and pay attention to what they were doing. But what I found interesting lately, and to be honest, I don't really pay that much attention to podcasts.
Sure.
I'm on more podcasts
That's
than I
okay.
listen to.
Fair enough.
I've got so many books to read. I can't be, and you can't read and listen to it. At least I can't. But I'm an outlier in terms of that. But the thing I've noticed about podcasts lately is that they seem to be bringing back the whole sponsored by, you know, this program is brought to you by, right? Which
Yeah.
was such a feature of early radio programming.
Yeah.
Was the announcer talking about this program is brought to you by Paul Molive. Paul Molive keeps your
Right.
hands soft as this
Right.
kind of thing. And that seems to be a trend surfacing from what I've seen in podcasting where, first or early on, the podcaster holds up some product and says, I'd like to tell you about this, who's sponsoring the show today, and use code beef jerky to get 5% off your next, thing. Um, it, this is one thing that um, people would do well to pay attention to, is that you can learn so much from older media,
Hmm.
because they took the time, they had the time, and they got it right. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that it, because every new medium tends to have its own grammar or kind of rules, right? Um, you're gonna you're gonna be tempted to just port over the way you've been doing things into the new thing, and it never works quite like that. So don't assume that the movie is just a book with visuals. Like, it's not the same thing.
Is it
I think
sort of
that's
the history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes sort of a thing? Like there are
Yeah.
common yeah, and I think we've learned a lot about where podcasting is going from radio, and yet it is not. It is entirely the
Mhm.
same, and it is entirely different all at once.
Well, the mobile factor is
Yeah,
is a huge difference, and something to play with. Like,
yeah,
it's difficult because advertisers and businesses tend to be very conservative.
hmm,
They want measurable results. They're putting real money into it, right?
right,
So they're not
Mhm.
here to play around. But you have to play around
hmm,
if you want to discover what this thing is and what the interaction is between audience and tool. And I think the history of advertising shows that the audience rewards that. Uh,
hmm,
they appreciate. For one thing, nobody likes being sold stuff, so you're already at a disadvantage.
hmm.
But people
That,
do love creativity,
mhm.
and if that's not a license to have some fun, I don't know what is.
Well, I was just going to sort of move us more from podcasting and into sort of advertising and advertising effectiveness generally, because obviously that's like you say, the be all and end all really for the clients.
Mm.
And I was rereading the chapter in Understanding Media about advertising today, and it's tricky in places. But one of the things that stuck with me was, I think Marshall said something like there's no point talking about product benefits anymore.
Mm.
And it was about how we come away from this sort of linear, sort of print derived way of thinking where you would kind of rationalize product benefits, which is sort of how advertising started in the
Yeah.
late 19th century, and
Yeah.
perhaps even early radio. And then once TV came along, and everything was so much more, I'm not quite
Hmm.
sure what the word is, but like the sort of immersive, sort of mosaic type sense, where they're much less linear, much less sort of logical. And
Yeah.
he's kind of alluding to the fact that it's much more, to be effective, you need to be much less rational. And he almost said something like, forget about the copy. Sorry, I know I shouldn't say that, Dan, but he was sort of implying like it's just all about a
Uh,
mood, and it's all about a sort of I don't know, I'm not articulating
Was
it well
did
at
he
all,
write
but
that in the '60s? Is that when
yeah,
that book came out?
yeah,
yeah, 64.
Yeah, right, because
The
the
thing is,
early yeah, go ahead.
the thing is that logic doesn't have the same
overrated.
level of persuasiveness that it
Mhm,
used to,
mhm,
right? You don't need to convince somebody by a reasoned argument.
Yeah,
And in fact, you can waste a lot of time trying to
yeah,
do that only for them to do something completely different.
mhm,
Because logic isn't what drives people's personal or purchasing decisions.
Yeah.
Um, but I think an interesting point. We're in crazy times for this, just because of what AI is doing. But and I'm not going to say that podcasting is AI proof. For one thing, search engine optimization, right, is meaningless when nobody's using a search engine.
Mhm.
When people are using whatever chat GPT or agent to find
Mhm.
something for them, right? So now you're not aiming your content at a person, you're aiming it at a bot, or you should be if you're smart, because things are changing. But to this extent, podcasting is AI proof in that sense, because nobody's bot is listening to this podcast for them.
Mhm.
You know, so it's
Mm.
you have you have a captive audience in that sense.
Well, I think that it's been interesting because in the last year, there's been some controversy as there have been AI driven manufacturers of content starting to kind of flood the zone, so to speak.
Sure.
And I think we're going to see more of that. And I think at some point it's going to be good. And so if I want to bone up on, the work of Marshall McLuhan, I'm sure AI will produce a very compelling, synthesized version of that, right? But but if you want to hear it come to life in an authentic way, it's this sort of thing where it's an intimate conversation, it's vulnerable, it's not all pre-planned and scripted. I think that's the essence of the medium, and I think that's its true
Yeah.
power, right? And so I
Yeah.
think that gives it durability.
And the difficulty is there is that your AI generated content is only as good as the lowest common denominator.
Right.
And that is its real weakness. So it can be entertaining, sure,
Mhm.
and it can be informing, but is it accurate? Well, when it comes to certainly my family's work, it's
Mhm.
not great,
Mm.
because Wikipedia is great proof of this. Looking up McLuhan on Wikipedia is terrible.
Mm.
It's real, even though it's gotten better, it's not good, because it's always secondhand, third hand interpretations. It's never primary sources. So, humans meaning interpretation is a very human thing. A cloud doesn't look like a damn thing except what it looks like to you. So humans tend to have a bit of a monopoly on these things, and AI is getting really, really, really good at faking it, but that only goes so far. And I've been very
Mm.
interested. There was a film that came out just a couple of years ago, a Canadian film about an artist's a work called Norval Morrisseau. It's a native Canadian painter, very famous, one of the early big native painters. And the film is a documentary, and it follows this guy who, a Canadian musician, who bought this, what he thought was a Morrisseau painting, and hung it proudly on his wall and enjoyed it, and would sit looking at it for hours and just had a spiritual connection with this painting. And the Toronto Museum got in touch one time to have it put in an exhibition, and he lent it to them. And the curator came back and said, I'm sorry, but we can't put this in the exhibition because it's a forgery. Okay. This raises some very interesting questions, because until you told him that, he didn't know. He thought he had this great work of art. He had spiritual connections with it. Um, but it wasn't real. Well, it was real, but it was fake, you know? And I think this relates very much to the AI question. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
on surface, if you're not looking carefully, it can be entertaining and fun and even have a lot of meaning. But ultimately, um, it's it it's not. It just looks like it.
Well, but hasn't the transactional always kind of um, had an interesting relationship with the human heart,
Mm.
um, where it can often get confused, right? So in some ways, that's maybe not as new, but we're going to be facing so much more of this, and especially as the technology gets better, and we really cannot perceive the difference. This feature we call
Yeah.
slop is, I think, um, confusing people about what's to come,
Uh-huh.
when you really can't discern, right? And so I think, as we're running down on time here, I don't know if this is an organic pivot to this idea of the global village,
Mm.
but I would just love to hear your guidance to practitioners in media, from whatever angle, about what is the world we're walking into, or maybe are already here and don't realize it, right? Um, and how can we best fortify what cannot be replaced, in this new world? Nothing, just thought I'd give you a
Just in the last
softball.
1 to 2
Just throw
minutes.
you a softball, yeah.
In a word,
30 seconds
in
or
one
less,
sense.
yeah.
I mean, so my grandfather said the global village, to talk about the effects of telegraph and radio, uh, well over 100 years ago.
Mm.
And he said that, with these forms, the world shrank to the size of a village.
Mhm,
Um, and a village and a city, are very different things. The thing about a village is, like, everybody. I live in a small town, so I can speak to this.
mhm,
Everybody. Everybody is in your business.
mhm.
It's not necessarily the bucolic kind of affair that you think it is.
Right.
And all of our technologies, deriving from electricity, have this effect of bringing us closer and closer and closer together, which, is good as far as it goes, but people also need personal space. Um, so, it's not necessarily, the greatest thing in the world. Sometimes we need distance. In fact, a lot of times we kind of crave that as much as we crave closeness. They go hand in hand. Um, you know, the thing for advertisers, and I think for everybody else to understand, is, the nature of experience, right? And what value things are. Coming back to the art thing, uh, there are thousands, tens of hundreds of thousands of posters of, Van Gogh's flowers or the Mona Lisa on people's walls. But nobody confuses it with the experience of standing in front of the Mona Lisa
Mm,
and being in the presence of that, right? Those
right.
experiences are irreplaceable. And they're also the things that really matter to us on a deep level. They have the most impact, and the things which are associated with them have that impact. So, again, it comes down to who you're trying to reach and what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to have an impact, you want to go one way. If you're just trying to stamp something on somebody's brain pan, hang a cheap print on their wall, well, there's a billboard for that, you know.
Mhm. Well said. And I feel like we really, we've talked about everything, but we really haven't started a conversation yet. I hope that this can be a series of some sort. I mean, Giles, I'll give you uh, last run here if there's
No,
anything else
I
you
don't
want
know
to
what I
try to
would add.
pick
I
up.
mean, there's so much that could be said, and it just feels like, yeah, we're just sort of beginning to get into stuff here potentially. But
I would just say, I just want to say, Andrew, in doing a little bit of prep for this conversation, first of all, I'm really smitten with your grandfather. Um,
Aw.
I mean, he just, because not only, was he so profound, but, I liked the way that I saw some interactive, interviews that he did,
Mhm.
and the way that he dealt with people, and kind of, there wasn't a lot of, I think he tried to stay out of the value judgments, and had a way to, he didn't really try to filter what questions were coming at him,
Yep.
but really tried to handle them honestly and graciously, and with, I think, a very a kind approach, not just an intellectual one.
Mhm.
Um, and it's it's amazing, if you think about when you think about the family business, as just to bring it back, like up the stairs in uh, s- wooden shoes and down in silk slippers, right? You're supposed to be the generation that ruins the legacy, and yet here you are preserving it for future generations, and I think it's really cool that you made the decision to protect and to preserve and to kind of carry the banner for
Uh,
the work that your family has now done for generations. So, and heaven knows it's a great time to be
Yeah,
stepping
more
outside
important
of
than
all
ever.
the reactions and thinking
mhm.
about it. Right?
Well, it's very kind of you to say. My grandfather. If you go onto YouTube or wherever else and look at some of his interviews, he treated things with a deep curiosity and sense of play and humor,
Hmm.
um, and uh, also very good that you picked up on the value judgment thing, because this was a very important part of his way of looking into these things. And it's not that he didn't have opinions or that nothing is good or bad. That's not the case. But as he said, a moral point of view is a poor substitute for understanding in technological
Mm,
matters.
mm,
The thing about people really desperately want you to just tell them, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah.
They really do.
yeah.
But whether it's a good thing or a bad thing is a very, very complicated answer that you can only give once you completely understand something. So, understanding comes first. And I think everyone will agree that we really don't understand very deeply what we're doing. So, how can we possibly have an opinion on it? So if you want to understand something, do your best to reserve judgment for a moment until you look into what it is and what it's doing to us, who we are and who we want to be. Then you can decide whether this is a good or a bad thing for us.
Well, thank you, Andrew. What a great way to bring it home. And thank you,
Thanks.
Giles, for jumping on at the last
Thank you,
minute
Andrew.
here. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in podcasting and audio and creator media, and to use your influence for good. As a member of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain but edify, and to build bridges across differences around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer and you want to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road. Just go to oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. It's called The Influencer. Andrew, you're going to love it. Um, and if you have feedback for us, it is the Breakfast of Champions. Let us know at info@mediaroundtable.com. And Andrew, where can people get more information about the Institute and the work that you are doing?
Oh, sure. It's themcluhaninstitute.com. I have a Substack newsletter called the McLuhan Newsletter. And otherwise, I'm too active on Twitter and other places like that.
Hmm. You mean SpaceX?
Sure.
Post the merger this week. Okay.
Thanks for
Well,
having me.
wonderful.
It's good
Thanks
to
for being
talk
here.
to
And
you.
thanks to Haley, Bianca, Rocio, Kyle, Ezra, Everett, Neil, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.